This morning, my message is I'm going to continue go. Global outreach. I'm going to talk about go. How in Mark 16:15, Jesus said this: go into all the world and preach the good news to everyone. Jesus said, go into all the world, preach the good news to everyone. Now we know no one person can do this. We know that no one church can do this alone. We need all of us to work together to go and fulfill these words. In fact, that's why we have global outreach. Global outreach is our missions. And in global outreach, when you abbreviate it, it's GO, which is go. And Jesus' words were go into all the world. And we support about 30 different missionaries and missions organizations who are all right now throughout the world, local and global, everywhere, preaching the gospel. They're all experiencing different trials and different things in different parts of the world with the COVID-19. Yet God is still moving and reaching people. And even more so now, they need our support to continue to help them. And how we support them is we mainly give financially to them. And we ask people once a year in May to say, hey, would you consider helping us support our missionaries? And we'd love to know about it. Why do we love to know about it? So we could be good stewards of the money, and we can know how much we're going to get, so we could let our missionaries who are in the field, who are doing the work, we can let them know that they could count on us. And so we just ask, if you want to help us, if you want to join us, we're at about 50% of our goal. Let's get 110% of our goal, because we got missionaries on the wait list we can start supporting. You go to lovejoy.org/go, lovejoy.org/go, and just let us know, this is what I'm going to try to do. We're not going to hold it over your head. We're not going to knock on your door, nothing. We just want to know so we could begin to budget and let our missionaries know that we could support them. We'd love for you to do that. If you're going to plan on giving, if you're going to keep doing what you're doing, anything like that, we would love to know so we could budget it and let our missionaries know they could count on us. 2 weeks ago when I last talked, I ended with the verse in Acts chapter 1, verse 8. And these are Jesus' words. It says in Acts 1:8, it says, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you will be my witnesses, telling people about me everywhere, in Jerusalem, throughout Judea, in Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. There was a lot of things we talked about this verse. We talked about being filled with the Holy Spirit. We talked about being witnesses. But I want to also remember we talked about the geography. Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. Jerusalem was their home. That's where they were. They start where their home, where they were. They go to Judea, the town over. And then we talked about Samaria, places they don't like to go, places that don't like them. Even in the places we don't want to go, God has called us to be witnesses. And what's really interesting is the entire book of Acts is actually the story of how the early church began. It's the story how the apostles began to build off of Jesus' words to go in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth, and to build the church and spread the gospel. In fact, the actual name of the book of Acts is really the Acts of the Apostles, because it's how they acted to build God's church. I have this study Bible I often use in my office, and I really like it because it breaks down the book of Acts into sections. In the first 7 chapters, it says it's the part of Acts that is the establishment of the church. It's labeled the establishment of the church. How in the first 7 chapters of the book of Acts, it's how the church was established. And if you were to read the first 7 chapters, you would see some things in there that show you that it's being established. For instance, on the day of Pentecost, they were filled with the Holy Spirit, and 3,000 people got saved. They were devoted to the apostles' teachings, to fellowship, to prayer, and to eating together. The church is being established. They were constantly preaching. They were constantly healing the sick and doing miracles. The church is being established. In fact, they were growing so much that they had to raise up more leaders, more people to do administrative tasks and to feed people. The church was being established. But then it says in chapter 8, marks the beginning of a new section. In chapter 8, it goes from the establishment of the church to the expansion of the church. And in chapter 8, there's a shift. If the church is now established, now they need to expand the church. They need to go and expand the church. And as the church began to expand, we will see that they begin to experience what I call growing pains. Growing pains. In fact, that's the title of my message today, Growing Pains. There's pains we often get in life that cause us to grow. Interesting story is that when I was a little boy, I had really bad growing pains. I was growing so big and so fast. Sometimes in the middle of the night, I would be screaming and crying, and sometimes I wouldn't even be awake. I didn't know I was doing it. And my mom would have to come in and stretch my legs and rub my legs because I had such bad growing pains. When a woman is pregnant, what happens? She experiences some growing pains. Her belly begins to grow, and all these other things happen, and they're painful. But the pain they get is because they're growing a human. They're growing life in their body. But we all know that growing pains aren't just physical. Growing pains happen when? When you start a new job, you got to learn new things, meet new people, there's growing pains. If you decide to go back to school, there's growing pains. Say you own a business and you want to grow your business, there's going to be a lot of growing pains. People are happy the way it is. They're not ready for the change. Say you want to raise your kids to a standard that's equal to the Bible. And you don't want to just plop them in front of a screen all day. You don't want the world to put all their beliefs and morality in them, and you want to raise them up right. There's pain to that. There's pain to growing your kids the right way. And there's also growing pains when we try to go into all the world and share the good news with people. There's growing pains when we try to begin to expand and grow God's church. But not all pain is wasted. As we will see in Acts chapter 8, pain can be the very push we need to grow. But before we start reading Acts chapter 8, let me give you a little context to how Acts chapter 7 ends. Because how Acts chapter 7 ends helps set the tone for the starting of Acts chapter 8, the expansion of the church. So as the church began to grow, and they began to get established in Jerusalem, more and more people were added. And with that, more and more problems happened, and they needed more and more leaders. The biggest need was, as the apostles so eloquently put it, we need someone to, I quote, someone to wait tables. Someone not to preach, not to run a ministry, but to wait tables, to ensure everyone is getting enough food. So they picked 7 men to do this. Now, I'm not going to mention all 7, but I'm going to talk about 2. The first one we're going to talk about later. His name was Philip. Put that in the back of your head. Later on, at the end of my message, we're going to bring up Philip. He was picked to wait tables. But the other one I want to mention, because he helps set the tone for the end of 7, start of chapter 8, is a guy named Stephen. Stephen was picked to wait tables. Now, the book of Acts tells us that Stephen began to do great miracles as he waited tables. Now, I don't know what kind of miracles he was doing. Maybe he was taking a letter out of Jesus' book and he was turning their water into wine, or maybe like they'd give him soup and he'd part the soup. I don't know. Maybe they'd order dessert and he'd multiply. I'd be like, did you say 2 scoops of ice cream? Or maybe you wanted 4. I don't know what kind of miracles he was doing. But it says Stephen was doing such good work as a server, as a waiter, that people began to, who were against Christianity, they wanted to argue with him. They wanted to prove him wrong because he was doing such a great work. And it says that in the Bible that they couldn't even stand against Stephen because of the wisdom and the Spirit of God in him. And so what they did was they convinced some other men in a crowd to begin to spread lies about him, saying Stephen was blaspheming God. And they got the crowd so riled up, that they actually stoned Stephen to death. And this guy, Stephen, was the first Christian martyr. He was the first person to die because he was a Christian. And that's how chapter 7 ends. That's how chapter 8 begins, is with the death of a Christian. That's how the church began to expand when someone they loved died. Let's read how the church expansion, the church growth started. In Acts chapter 8, verse 1 says this: on that day, a great persecution broke out. We all have our own on that day, isn't that right? On that day. On that day, for me, my friend, she died on a plane crash a couple miles from her home. For you, it might be on that day I got diagnosed with cancer. On that day, I caught them cheating. On that day, I lost my job. It was on that day that we lost the baby. It was on that day that I never saw them again. It was on that day that we signed the divorce papers. And guess what? It was on that day that the church began to expand. Acts 8:1, on that day, a great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. It was on that day a great persecution started, and it caused them to go. It caused them to go. Where did they go? They actually went, where does it say? They went from the church in Jerusalem, the persecution broke out in Jerusalem, and they literally went to Judea and Samaria, the very places Jesus said for them to go in Acts chapter 1, verse 8. It was on that day. Maybe for you, it was on that day when you thought all was lost. When you thought that my life was over. When you thought that the addiction would finally get you. It was on that day that the church began to grow. Let me say it another way. It was on that day that they began to fulfill the command of Jesus. When all seemed lost, when things went from bad to worse, to I can't believe this is really happening, that's when they started to fulfill the command of Jesus to go. It doesn't make sense. Those things sound like opposites. Shouldn't things get better when I serve God? Shouldn't my finances go up when I give to God? Shouldn't things get better when I start to read my Bible? I mean, I even listened to Pastor Jonathan's message, and I went home and I talked to someone, and it was on that day my wife got mad at me. It was on that day I lost my temper at my son. It was on that day, and sometimes we think life will just get better when we start to serve God. But the persecution actually pushed the Christian church to go beyond Jerusalem into Judea and Samaria. One commentary, it says this is very fascinating. One commentary says that these persecutions helped. These persecutions helped them to spread the gospel. The persecutions helped them to grow. The pain helped them to grow. They had growing pains. In football, when I played college football, I have hurt my back real bad. I've shared this multiple times. I have 2 herniated discs. And I never did anything for it. Even in football, I barely did the stretches. I barely took care of it. I beat my back up so bad. Until one day, the pain became so great in my back that I couldn't take it anymore. I could hardly walk. I could barely move. And the pain forced me to take care of my back. The pain forced me to begin to go to physical therapy, to stretch, to strengthen my back, to work hard. And the pain became so great that it actually forced me to grow. The growing pains of the coronavirus, guess what? They've helped more people at our church to give online than ever before. The growing pains of the coronavirus has helped our church to give more money back into the community and to be the church more than we have in the past. The growing pains of the coronavirus has helped us to start live streaming our service so we can reach way more people than we were in person. The growing pains of the coronavirus has helped our church staff to find new ways to reach out to people, to connect with people, and to be creative. Sometimes pain helps you grow. Let's continue the story. Verse 2 says this: godly men buried Stephen and mourned deeply for him. Guess what? There might be mourning. There might be sorrow. There might be weeping. But King David wrote in Psalm 30 that weeping may last through the night, but joy comes in the morning. Another way you could interpret that is this: weeping, sorrow, the pain of the moment may last for a time, but not forever. As surely as the sun rises in the morning, so will that time of pain eventually end. It won't last forever. And the truth is, the ending of your weeping is the beginning of your rejoicing. And it's through those times that God brings us to a place for a special purpose that he has for us. In fact, in that same psalm, in Psalm 30, verses 11 and 12, David continues. He says, "You have turned my mourning into joyful dancing. You have taken away my clothes of mourning and clothed me with joy, that I might sing praises to you and not be silent. Let me share something with you. Don't let worry stop your worship. Don't let fear control your faith. And don't let sorrow silence your song. Don't let your worry stop you from worshiping God. Don't let your fear start to control your faith and do things you know is against your faith. And don't let your sorrow silence the song God has given you. Don't let your growing pain stop you. Don't let it cause you to give up. Because God isn't wasting your pain. It's growing you to accomplish something great. Let's continue. Verse 3 says this. But Saul began to destroy the church. Going from house to house, he dragged off both men and women and put them in prison. Now that phrase, destroy the church, other translation use something like, they say, made havoc. Saul made havoc for the church. Now, I grew up in church my whole life. And I've met some people who've made havoc for the church. I've met some troublemakers in the church. But let me tell you something, I never met anyone like Saul. Because the word used in the Greek symbolizes a brutal cruelty. It's used as a wild boar ravaging a vineyard, or wild animals savaging a body. And you got to first notice that this is speaking of an absolute brutal persecution. It's not just people bashing you on Facebook. It's not just someone posting a controversial article. Second thing to notice is who is leading this persecution. It's a guy named Saul. Saul started the persecution, but remember, weeping may last for the night, but joy comes in the morning. It may last for a time, but it's not going to last forever, because in the very next chapter, the one who is ravaging the church begins the biggest and greatest advocate for the church and to help the gospel go into all the world. Saul goes from destroying the church to building the church. Just as the ending of one chapter started a great persecution, the ending of the next one opened the door for some of the fastest and greatest growth of the church. Let me say it another way in today's language. 2020 started off great, but that chapter had ended. And now we entered a worldwide pandemic. And in this chapter, we are stuck at home. Businesses are closed. Schools are closed. People are dying. There's fear. There's hopelessness. We don't know when it's going to end. But please realize that this too will end. And when this chapter closes, it will start a new chapter. And when that chapter starts, I believe it's going to open up a door for some of the greatest harvest and some of the greatest amounts of people coming to the church than we're going to see in my lifetime. I believe as this chapter ends, God's going to open up a new chapter. Mourning may last for the night, but joy comes in the morning. And when that time happens, I believe we're going to see a great harvest of people coming to Christ. This is why it's so important that we continue to support our missionaries. Because there's going to be a time where more and more people come to Christ all around the world. And we need to continue to help them preach the gospel. And we need to continue to do it here. Let's continue the story. Verse 4 says this. Those who had been scattered preached the word wherever they went. Those who had been scattered preached the word wherever they went. You know what this makes me think of? It makes me think of this, that comfort can lead to complacency. Comfort can lead to complacency. What's that mean? It means that when we get too comfortable, we can easily become complacent. We don't see the need to move forward. We don't see the need to work hard or to bring change. I wonder how many of us began to get so comfortable with our faith, with our lives, that we began to do things differently than when we first got saved, than when we first came to Christ. And here we see that the persecution forced the believers out of Jerusalem, and along with them went the gospel. And sometimes we have to become uncomfortable before we'll move. We might not want it, we might not like it, and we might not want to do it, but it causes us to change. In fact, I've heard it said that you never change until the pain of staying the same is greater than the pain of change. We don't change until the pain of staying the same becomes greater than the pain of change, just like with my back. I wouldn't change. I wouldn't do the exercise. I wouldn't do the work until the pain of staying the same was worse than doing exercises and working hard. And when you are tempted to complain and gripe about how comfortable life is, how bad these circumstances are, how about we first stop and ask God what He might be preparing us for? 6 years ago, I was working at a college ministry, and 6 years ago, God gave me an opportunity to take over this ministry, and I began to take over this entire ministry. We had 8 staff. We lost 5 of them. We were down to 3 staff. Luckily, my wife joined, so now we had 4 staff. And it was a difficult situation. I didn't know how we were going to do it. And through this time, there was some pain, there was some difficulty learning to work with my wife. But all of a sudden, my wife began to grow into this amazing person. All these gifts I never knew about. You think she's good at worship leading. You see all the other things she could do. All of a sudden, I began to grow. I began to learn how to work with people and be patient and kind. I began to grow in ways I didn't know I could grow in. And if it wasn't for that difficult time of pain and growth, me and her could not be the leaders of this church that we are today. We wouldn't have been able to lead through this time if it wasn't for the pain that caused us to grow 6 years earlier. Let's continue the story. Verse 5 says this: Philip went down to a city in Samaria and proclaimed the Messiah there. When the crowds heard Philip and saw the signs he performed, they all paid close attention to what he said, for with shrieks impure spirits came out of many, and many who were paralyzed or lame were healed. So there was great joy in that city. First off, remember, this Philip is not the apostle Philip. This is the Philip I told you to remember. This is the Philip, he was one of the 7 who was picked to wait tables. He was a waiter. This Philip was forced to go to Samaria because of persecution. In fact, 2 weeks ago when I talked about how there was this deep-seated hatred between the Samaritans and the Jews, and how sometimes Jesus has called us to go to the Samarias in our lives, the places that we don't like. But think of this not from Philip's perspective. Think of this from the Samaritans' perspective. The Samaritans were rejected by the Jews because they were considered half-breeds, because they intermarried with non-Jewish people. And for generation after generation, they were rejected, they were hurt, they were pushed away, and they were abandoned by the Jews. Yet, because of this persecution, Philip told them the gospel, the good news of Jesus, and they accepted it from him, a Jew. The gospel brought healing to people who had generational rejection and hurt. And the fact that they accepted the message from a full-blooded Jew is just solidifying the fact that that was healed in them, that their hearts were healed and made whole. Philip had, from our world standards, everything working against him. First, he wasn't one of the apostles. He wasn't a preacher. He wasn't a religious leader. He was a waiter, a server. Second, he was a full-blooded Jew in Samaria, the very place where Samaritans disliked Jews. Now, if anyone would think they're disqualified for a specific task, I would think this would be it. He's in the wrong profession, and he's speaking to the wrong people. Yet, Philip didn't give up. He wasn't silent. Every Jewish boy was taught the Old Testament. They read it, they memorized it, they quoted it daily, they deeply studied it. And we know throughout Philip's life, there's no way that he didn't study the Old Testament. We know he knew the Old Testament. We know Philip even studied the prophets and knew them. Why the prophets? Because the prophets often spoke of the day the Lord would come and heal the land. The prophets often spoke of the time and the day that God would come and restore his kingdom. And I wonder, just a thought, if when Philip was in Samaria, the prophet Jeremiah came to Philip's mind. Because in Jeremiah 29, God spoke a word to Jeremiah, and he wrote it down and sent it as a letter to all the Jews who were captives in a foreign land. See, they were ripped from their homes and brought to a foreign land that they didn't like with people who didn't like them. And here's the word of the Lord. Just one verse, Jeremiah 29:7 says this: "Seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper." And the reason I think it's very reasonable that Philip might have thought about Jeremiah 29 was because of the similarities between him and the Israelites who were in captivity. Philip was persecuted and fled to Samaria. The Israelites were conquered in battle and taken to Babylon. Both ripped from their homes, both ended in cities they didn't like, both lived with people who didn't like them. And I wonder if instead of complaining, of crying, of acting like his life was all over, I wonder if he remembered the words of Jeremiah. I wonder if he understood that wherever he was, even if he disagreed with the government, even if he didn't like the people, even if he didn't like the place, that despite that, the word of the Lord was and the word of the Lord continues to be, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which God has you. To pray to God for it. Because the truth is, if the city you live in prospers, you too will prosper. So Philip did not keep silent. He preached the word of God even in Samaria. And because of that, people got saved, and there was a great joy in that city. This is why we need global outreach. Because we need people who are willing to follow the command of Jesus to go into all the world and preach the good news to everyone. But we also need people who are willing to support them financially, emotionally, and in prayer. We have around 30 missionaries who are going all over the place, reaching people everywhere with the good news. There is healing of broken hearts happening. Joy is being spread, and people are helping those in need. And this opportunity to support them is so important, and it's such a must for us to continue to support them. Here's how we do it at Lovejoy. Every year in May, we ask, would you support our missionaries for another year? I'm not talking about tithes. We're not talking about offerings. Something besides that. Would you give specifically to Global Outreach? Would you give specifically to our Go Fund? We just ask again, could you let us know what you want to do? We want to raise all the money. We were halfway there. We have another half to go. Go to lovejoy.org/go, lovejoy.org/go to let us know. But let me end in Jeremiah 29, a couple verses later. Jeremiah is writing to these captives. Remember, they're in captivity in Babylon. And verse 11, he says, "For I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord. They are plans for good and not for disaster, to give you a future and a hope." Now, we all love this verse because we think we know the plans God has for us, but that's not what it says. It says God knows the plans. God knows the plans, not you. God knows the plans He has for you. And honestly, if I think about myself, it's probably a good thing that I don't know all the plans and all the details. It's probably a good thing that I don't know all the growing pains I have to go through, because I may quit before I get to all the good stuff. But remember, when God said these famous words, they weren't living a great life. They weren't free in their own land. They were living in captivity in a foreign land. And I kind of feel like quarantine is a modern day captivity, right? I mean, we can't go wherever we want. We can't do whatever we want. We don't know when it will end. But guess what? God knows the plans He has for you. You don't know the plans. You may not know how it's going to end. You may not know how it's going to work out, but that's okay because God knows. He knows the plans. And they're not for a disaster, they're for good. They're for a future and a hope. We see quarantine. We see sickness. We see no hope. We see no end in sight. We see division. We see fighting in politics. We see fighting in policy. But God knows something we don't. God knows the plan for us during this time, and it may not look good, but we need to have faith that God is working for our good and for our future. We need to have faith that the growing pains we are going through aren't just to torture us, they're to prepare us for what I believe will be one of the biggest harvests in my lifetime.